BYU had a great season, 10-2. They will get absolutely positively zero consideration to be an at-large playoff team. Miami's in the same boat. Is that right? That's Drake Toll, Locked On Big 12. You think it's wrong, Drake. Why?
Yeah, I think it's wrong because BYU to this point deserves a shot that isn't a hypothetical. Oh, well, BYU would lose to Alabama. They would lose to South Carolina. We know they would lose to Ole Miss and Miami, except we don't know that. We keep playing these hypothetical games of what about these 9-3 SEC teams that should be ranked above BYU? Well, BYU's 10-2. What about this Miami team?
Michigan's going to lose to Ohio State. Vandy's going to lose to Bama. Kentucky's beating Ole Miss. Hypotheticals, man.
You've been listening
undefeated,
to
right?
A lot of On 3 and ESPN, my friend. Very good. Picking up a national narrative that to me just isn't. If we do the blind test of college football playoff contenders, BYU has 2 ranked wins. One of those is a top 10 win. That's more than South Carolina. For BYU, win against Power Fours, they have 8. South Carolina has 6, and one of their 2 losses was against a ranked team in the Big 12 championship who is going to play for a spot in the college football playoff. Their other loss was our preseason Big 12 champion who didn't pan out. But what I think you see a lot of times in the SEC is that Kentucky loss or that Arkansas loss, whether it's Tennessee or Ole Miss, they're losing to teams that aren't on a win streak, that aren't hot. They're these sporadic, weird Oklahoma, Alabama. Oh, you lost. Whereas in the Big 12, a lot of these upsets were facing a Kansas team that rattled off 4 straight and looked dominant for a stretch of their season. Looked like the preseason Kansas we were promised. So I don't consider those to be as fluky as a lot of people would look from the, oh, you're 10-2 and lost to Kansas standpoint. I think BYU has a fighter's chance when you look at 9-3 ahead of them. BYU's 10-2, and those SEC teams played 8 conference games and then 4 random one-off games aside from that South Carolina Clemson game. I want to know why the SEC can keep getting away with that, and the Big 12 has to sit idle with the team that's got more wins than them.
I think this is an appropriate time to bring up the ridiculousness of the late season SEC ACC cupcake. I am in favor of a 9-game conference slate. I am not as aggrieved about it when your non-conference game or one of them is a protected rivalry against the ACC. So sure. Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, South Carolina, Florida, Florida State. Those sorts of games, if that's what your 9th conference game would be and it's that instead, I am okay with it.
Yeah.
But where I'm not okay, Drake, is to your point. What if BYU, do you realize that BYU, if they'd been able to schedule Mercer the second to last week, Wofford, the Citadel, if they'd been able to do that in the second to last week of the regular season, they would be in the college football playoff right now, and no one, not a single person, would bat an eye or seriously object.
Can I tell you the
yes,
main
you
thing
can.
that
I will permit it.
Learned this week is your non-conference games, don't play anybody. Don't. Go 4-0, 3-0 in non-conference, get to the end of the year, and let your record speak for itself. Why? Because I would rather beat Wofford than lose to a pretty solid LSU team or lose to a decent team that's in the top 15 like Miami. I would rather beat Wofford than have a loss in my record, and you're seeing that right now.
I see that. Allow me to present the other side of it. The reason we can have this discussion and why I do believe there is some validity to it, BYU, and yeah, you can say the SEC is better in the Big 12 if you would like, but BYU has played more Power 4 teams and they didn't have a cupcake late in the conference. It's not just that there's one less conference game. It's that when everyone's beat up, when everyone's grinding, when Oregon's going to Wisconsin and grinding out, or Penn State's going to Minnesota and they're eking out wins because they're playing a conference opponent, these teams are playing schools that have zero chance of winning the football game. BYU, though.
Hey, ask Auburn in 2023.
Well, that was at least, an FBS team, not an FCS team. But hey, Hugh Freeze will be back for another year, so you never know. There's still time. But I think that for BYU, one of the reasons that I think this is a reasonable discussion to have, and not just, the Big 12 getting screwed, but actually look at the nuts and bolts of the Alabama versus BYU resume comparison, is Alabama's got a top 10 win, right? Against Georgia. What does BYU have? Oh, that's right. A top 10 win. So there's a risk reward calculation. Like imagine if you were, and clearly it hasn't been enough, but imagine if you were comparing 9-3 Alabama to 10-2 BYU. That's not what they're doing. They're just completely overlooking a BYU or even a Miami in this spot for that matter. Miami's got a better record against bowl-eligible teams than Alabama does, but Alabama's got the Georgia win, and Miami's got a win against Florida, which only counts as a great loss for Ole Miss, does not count as a good win for Miami, of course.
Yeah, and if you look at the BYU game against SMU, now we're talking about, what if Clemson gets a win against the regular season ACC champion? Didn't BYU already do that and on the road, not at a neutral site? That was one of the main questions that national analysts have asked this week as well. Clemson now has a win against the regular season champ. But then I raised my hand and say, well, we have that too. We already did that on the road. But what I've learned is anything that happened in September doesn't exist. Hey, it's a brand new football team now. They're playing different ball. There was that key injury. We do this every single year. Oh, that Notre Dame loss, forget about it. It's a mulligan. In a 12-team playoff, you get a mulligan. The only time you don't is when you lose late. Had BYU lost these two games in the first three of their season in the same format to Kansas and a top 15 team, they would be a top 10, top 15 squad, undoubted right there in the mix.
I don't know about top 10, but I think top 15. I think they'd be more in the mix because I agree.
If they won 8 straight, I mean that you're just climbing from there. You're ascending, and Spencer,
that's true. That's the South Carolina. That's the South Carolina discussion. It's like, oh my gosh, they're red hot. You got to put them in. Like, no, you can't because these results happen. I'm sorry you don't like the outcome for this or that reason, but even if you put the LSU game aside and the bad call from the officials, you still had a chance to beat Bama. You didn't. You still could have beaten Ole Miss at home. You got walloped. Yeah. Those things have to matter. But the reason that I'm rooting for Clemson this week, Drake, is if they win, this is all simplified. Because, I hope and pray, cannot guarantee, I hope and pray 11-2 SMU isn't bypassed for a 9-3 Alabama team that got whooped by Oklahoma.
Yep. And at that point, if Clemson does win, I agree with you there. We can decide, all right, there's no other Big 12 team getting in. There's no way we have a 9-3 SEC team that we have to let in here over an SMU who sits with 2 losses. But what did the committee tell us, Spencer? If you lose in your conference championship game, we're not going to harm you for that. It doesn't. I mean,
I'm so glad you mentioned that because what do you want to bet?
It's the biggest
Arizona State has a 0, and I mean 0% chance of getting into the playoff if they lose to Iowa State this Saturday. For sure.
And to that point, at the end of the year, if you go, hey, Arizona State's the Big 12's regular season champion, they're going to the playoff. Like, okay. In any given year where the Big 12's got a team who's 5th and 9th, don't play the conference championship game. Just don't. There's no point in playing a conference title game at that point because you're going to get left out if you're that 9th ranked team and you lose. I guarantee it. They're lying to you. This is a fun thing. It's a fun narrative to have until it goes against the Big 12 and they just, that's low-hanging fruit and leave you out of the college football playoff with a 2-bid league. And we're only going to get one in. That's it. But if you blind resume it,
the Big 12 is going to get in. Think about this. The Big 12 is going to get in the same number of teams as the Group of 5.
Yes.
And you can throw that accusation, the Big 12 is a Group 5 conference. I am watching these college football games play out all across the country. There is no way, a couple of things. The gap between the SEC and the Big 12 and the ACC is as big as you thought it was. Georgia Tech is just one example of that. There are others, but that's one particular example. And to pretend that a team in the Group 5, if they have a great season, would have the same record if they were in the Big 12 or the ACC? Absolutely, positively. I know we're not big on hypotheticals here, but I'm not buying that, Drake. I don't know who would put their money on it. Or here's another way to think about it. If you did what college basketball does, and you do conference challenges, and you were to say, all right, we're going to put R1 against your 1 and R2 against you, and you go all the way down. Big 12 against the Mountain West. Top to bottom, 1 through however many teams are in the Mountain West, because probably not quite as many as the Big 12. Who is going to put their money on the Mountain West?
Hey, who's going to put their money on the Big 10? You get to Team 5 and you start going, oh, shoot. Things get real thin in that conference after you get after you get past the top half. Whereas in the Big 12, we've had like 8 teams ranked this year because at any point in time, these schools have gotten hot and played good football. Baylor is a great example of that, too, at 8-4 now under Dave Aranda, having won 6 straight. So,
Baylor, 8-4. How about that?
The Bears. They're keeping the coach. They're keeping
How
the
about before you go, Drake,
Yeah.
A 5-second response. Rich Rodriguez to West Virginia. Does it make any sense?
Not when Nick Saban has already accepted the job. Thank you, Spencer. Always a
Drake
pleasure.
Toll, locked on Big 12. Serious, a solid 60% of the time, and we appreciate that.
Whatever.